Hi everyone, this is Jessica with Longform Studio, and today I'm going to be answering the most fundamental question about gouache. What is it? So gouache is a water-soluble, water-based paint that is made up of pigment particles. The pigment particles are basically colored pieces of crushed up stone. Gouache is in the same family of paints as watercolors and poster paints, which you may be more familiar with. The main difference between these three types of paints that I will be using as a comparison today is the size of the pigment particles. And this is what I find super fascinating, and it's changed my whole perspective on how I can use these water-based paints. So I've read a few articles about the differences between these water-based paints, and I will link those in the notes below. The best way that I can think of to demonstrate to you the differences is to make an illustration about it. So I like to use 300 GSM watercolor paint. That's what this watercolor block is here. But imagine that we are zooming in on the paper. Imagine that these peaks are the surface area of the paper and the valleys are the what we'll call pores of the paper. For watercolor, we will use this little pink dot as demonstration. For gouache, maybe we will use this orange color. And for the poster paints, we'll use this dark purple. Watercolor, which I'll be demonstrating with this pink marker, has super fine pigment particles. Watercolor has the smallest particle size out of the three water-based paints that I'll be discussing today. Because the particles are so fine, when you apply it onto the paper, they sink down low into the pores of the paper. And that is what gives you that really transparent look where you can see the surface of the paper below the paint. Poster paint, which I'll be demonstrating with this purple marker, is on the other side of the spectrum. Poster paint has the largest pigment particle size of the three water-based paints, and what happens is when you paint with poster paint, because the particles are so large, it sits on top of the surface of the paper, giving you an opaque effect. What makes gouache such a flexible medium, in my opinion, are its medium-sized pigment particles. The size of the particles lie between watercolor and poster paints. And so what happens is when you paint with gouache, they don't sink down as far as the watercolor paints would into the pores of the paper, but it does sink down somewhat in between. And so because gouache does not sink down as far down into your paper as watercolor pigment particles would, the effect is not as translucent as watercolor, but you can still get that translucent effect. The pigment particles are larger with gouache, and so you will see that the color is deeper and richer and more opaque. The cool thing about gouache is you can build opacity. So imagine that your pigment particles are like little bricks that you are laying down on top of each other. The first layer of gouache paint that you put down on your paper will sink down into the pores of your paper. But as you continue to layer more paint on top, it will build in opacity, bringing the pigment particles to the surface of the paper. The more you build, the more opaque it will become. With jelly gouache or gouache in a tube, of course, you can lay it on thick from the outset, in which case, even though the texture will be different, it will act more like poster paint, which is opaque from the start. The nice thing about gouache, though, is that you do have that flexibility between translucent and then building up in opacity. Different from water-based paints, acrylic paints form at that plasticky layer over the top when dry. And so when you are layering colors on top of each other, then you kind of can build this texture where you can see brush strokes, or if you lay it on really thick, you can have peaks of paint that will kind of dry, depending more so with oil, but you can have textural layers. And in addition, acrylic paint, unless you're using a special matte variety, when it does dry, it leaves like a little bit of a sheen where the light can catch it. Gouache, on the other hand, dries matte and flat. And so even if you layer or put on the paint really thick, gouache paint will have a tendency to lay down flat once it's dry, and it will be matte in nature. My last fun fact about gouache is that unlike acrylic, which will dry with that plasticky skin on the top, gouache, which is water-based, can be reactivated by water. And this can be both a blessing and a curse. A curse if you have completed a section of your painting that you are super happy with, and you have no intention of altering again, and then all of a sudden you just splash a bunch of water on top of it. The paint will be reactivated and it'll change the entire look of your painting. The blessing is that it gives you a lot of flexibility in being able to manipulate the paint, make alterations, kind of using a technique to almost like erase mistakes or make them more translucent so that you can then layer on other colors after. So you have a lot of flexibility there in playing with the water and the reactivation. And so what is gouache? It is a water-based paint that has medium-sized pigment particles, medium being larger than watercolor pigment particles, but smaller than the pigment particles contained in poster paint. It is a paint that dries flat and matte, and it is a paint that can be reactivated by water. I'm sure that there are a lot of other special qualities about gouache, some that we can explore in future videos, but I hope that I've answered your basic questions about what this medium is and how you can use it. Thanks so much, and I hope to see you on the next one. Bye!